The emperor, who arrived by 11 o'clock, ordered the Prince of Eckmühl to quicken his march and move to the right of Prince Eugene, whom the guard were also ordered to support. The First Army Corps went into the line about 2 o'clock. We could see perfectly the movements of the Russians and expected that Kutuzov would take full advantage of this very strong position to block our advance and himself take the offensive. But the Fourth Army Corps proved sufficient. Davout was hardly engaged. We had at least 4,000 men put out of action, and a remarkable number of Russians were killed. That night and the following day, together with the emperor, I went over the battleground most carefully. We blamed Kutuzov for sacrificing a good number of men, only to be beaten in the end and fail of his object. For since he defended his position, he must have intended to hold it, at least till nightfall. The truth is that Kutuzov, having learnt of the emperor's movements only on the 23rd, was taken by surprise. The successive bodies of troops, which arrived later to support Doktorov, were only put into action to cover the retreat of his army upon Yukhnov, for he was unwilling to run the risks of a pitched battle. The general opinion was that Kutuzov might have better defended his position. For our part, we had to leave it in their hands of a small rear guard. Some Cossacks appeared that evening on the right of Gorodnia, where headquarters had been established in a weaver's hut. They were thought to be a party that had lost their way and would blunder into our outposts. We paid less attention to them than we might have done, because about noon in the same district, but on the left of the road, we had chased off some new Cossacks wearing crosses on their caps. They were mounted troops, founded on the model of the Don Cossacks and named after the provinces that provided them. 2 army corps were drawn up beyond the town, but the roads were so broken up that only one section of the artillery had been able, and that with difficulty, to reach their position. The emperor moved back to spend the night, October 24th, 25th, in the hut near the bridge at Gorodnia, a small hamlet 1 league from Malo Yaroslavets. Nearly all of us camped in the open. The viceroy's success had gotten us nowhere. We held the field, but Kutuzov had given us the slip. Our situation was therefore unchanged, and the army was not in a position to pursue the enemy. The emperor spent the night in receiving reports, issuing orders, and on this occasion discussing his difficulties with the Prince of Neuchâtel. He sent for me several times, and also for Duroc and the Duke of Istria, and discussed matters with us, but without reaching any decision. Should he follow Kutuzov, who, having abandoned an impregnable position, had probably eluded us? And what route should he take to Smolensk if he did not find the enemy drawn up beyond Malo Yaroslavets? He had to make up his mind, and the course that drew the emperor away from his enemy, whose measure he so much wanted to take, was always the one that came hardest to him. An hour before daybreak, the emperor sent for me again. We were alone. He looked very preoccupied and seemed anxious to relieve himself of the thoughts that oppressed him. "This is a bad business," he said. "I beat the Russians every time, but that doesn't get me anywhere." After a quarter of an hour of silent pacing back and forth in his little hut, the emperor went on, "I'm going to find out for myself whether the enemy are drawing up for battle or whether they are retreating, as everything suggests. That devil Kutuzov will never make a fight of it. Fetch the horses, let's be off." As he spoke, he picked up his hat to go. The Duke of Istria and the Prince of Neuchâtel, who luckily happened to enter just as the emperor was starting out, joined me in trying to persuade him to wait until dawn. They reminded him that it was very dark, and that he would reach the outpost before it was light enough to see, and that, as the guard had taken up their positions by night, no one was certain where the corps lay. The emperor, however, was still resolved to go until one of the viceroy's aides-de-camps arrived to announce that, though nothing could be seen of the enemy but the fires of the Cossacks, some peasants and soldiers had just been taken, who confirmed the news of their retreat. These particulars made the emperor decide to wait, but a half hour later, his impatience drove him to start. Dawn was hardly showing, and 3/4 of a mile from headquarters, we found ourselves face to face with some Cossacks belonging to a troop of which the greater part who were ahead of us had set upon an artillery park where they heard some guns moving. They had carried off several pieces. It was still so dark that we were warned only by their shouts and were almost upon them before we could see them. It was so unexpected to find them inside the lines where our guard were bivouacked that, I must admit, we paid little heed to the first shouts. It was only when the shouting increased and closed in around the emperor that General Rapp, who was ahead of him with Lauriston, Lubau, and Durenel, the orderly officers on duty, and the advance guard of the picket, came back to the emperor and said, "Halt, sire, the Cossacks." "Take the chasseurs of the picket," he answered, "and go forward." The chasseurs, only 10 or 12 of whom had so far joined us, were already moving forward unbidden to join the advance guard. The light was still so poor that nothing could be seen more than 25 yards away. Only the clash of arms and the shouts of the men fighting indicated the direction of the skirmish, or even that we were at grips with the enemy. Monsieur Emmanuel Lecouteau, the Prince of Neuchâtel's aide-de-camp on duty, had a saber run clean through his chest by a trooper of the guard who mistook him for a Russian. The emperor was left alone with the Prince of Neuchâtel and myself. All three of us held our swords drawn. As the fighting was very near and shifting closer towards him, the emperor decided to move off several yards onto the crest of the rise so as to see better. At this moment, the remaining chasseurs of the picket caught up with us, and the squadrons in attendance, to whom the emperor had not given time to mount horse before he set out, came up immediately after. Guided by the shouts of those already engaged, the first two squadrons to arrive charged and broke up the foremost Cossacks. The two other squadrons, who were close behind, headed by the Duke of Istria, came up in time to support the first two and were hard-pressed and surrounded by a swarm of the enemy. By this time, daylight was near enough to light up the scene. The plain and the road were alive with Cossacks. The guard recaptured the guns and the few artillerymen in the enemy's hands and forced the Cossacks to recross the river, but we were left with many wounded. It is clear that if the emperor had set out, as he had wished, before dawn, he would have found himself in the midst of this swarm of Cossacks with only his picket and 8 generals and officers who accompanied him. If the Cossacks who came face to face with us and at one moment surrounded us had shown more courage and fallen upon our route silently, instead of shouting and wrangling at the side of the road, we should have been carried off before the squadron could rescue us. No doubt, we should have sold our lives as dearly as one can by hitting out blindly with a light sword in the dark, but the emperor would certainly have either been killed or captured. No one would even have known where to look for him. In a wide plain, dotted all over with clumps of trees under cover of which the Cossacks had been able to hide within the musket shot of the road and the guard. If these details had not the testimony of the army and of so many trustworthy men to confirm them, they might be called in question. And how, indeed, can anyone believe that a man of such foresight, a sovereign, and the greatest commander of all time, could have been in danger of capture 500 yards from his headquarters, on a high road, the route of the march of the whole army, and among the bivouacs of a considerable guard, both of cavalry and infantry? Is it credible that 1,000 men could have lain in ambush and passed the night within the range of 3 or 4 musket shots from our headquarters without being discovered? But this is all explained and proved by the following particulars, which I have summarized with care as being illustrative of the emperor's habits. We had very few light-armed troops left. They had not been spared and were sorely harassed. And since they had been sent that same day to other points, the section of our position was poorly covered. In general, our men fought well, but kept a poor lookout. In no other army can the duties of reconnaissance have been so neglected. At nightfall, they set up a few sentry posts hither and yon, so as to have time to mount before the enemy might arrive, but they seldom took the trouble to cover rear or flank.